Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. We had a question written into us. Actually, it's been some time, but we were going through different, points of confusion that people have about personality typology. And in particular, I'm just noticing that everybody's, I don't know, maybe it's just me because we have different Facebook groups around typology and we have a community online. And the number one thing that people seem to be asking all the time is, how do I figure out my type? Like, that's the number one thing. And of course, that's the starting point, right? People feel like the online test that they take will be that's the magic bullet. If I take a test and then that's my type, then that's my type. And then they'll start engaging with these different communities, or they'll start reading more information about typology and in particular cognitive functions. And then now the confusion sets in, right? Like, wait, I thought I was this type according to the test, and now I'm feeling more like this type, or maybe even two different types or three, and I'm kind of identifying myself all over the map. And then the confusion sets in, and then the journey, which was actually started when they took their online test or took a written version of a test. That was actually when the journey started. They didn't know that was the start of the journey. They thought that they'd closed the door. But now they realize they're on a path. And so people are perpetually asking questions about refining how to understand type. And so we become one of those resources. And somebody wrote in a very interesting question, I thought, which is, can sensors be bilingual with intuitive conversation? One of the reasons why they ask this is because we posit that one of the ways a person can know whether or not they're intuitive is that they have a high threshold for what we call intuitive conversation. Conversation around things that are kind of abstract or conceptual, speculative, conversations that may or may not have any actual application in the real world at this moment, may not have application for many years down the line, or may not be something we'll ever know. And so that's one of the determiners that people use. I don't know if determiner is a word, but one of the determinations that people will use to figure out whether or not they're sensor and intuitive. And somebody wrote in and said, hey, I think I might be a sensor, but I have like a kind of a high threshold for intuitive conversation. So is it possible for a sensor to be bilingual? And I missed this piece, which is that we posit that intuitives frequently become bilingual because intuitives are a smaller percentage of the population. So most people are speaking a more sensor language, which is more concrete and more grounded in the realities around us. There are things that don't have a speculative sort of bent. There are things that are more known and knowable. And so intuitives, because intuitives are surrounded by sensors most of the time, especially if an intuitive was raised in a sensor family, then intuitives pick up sensor language because that's the common vernacular of most of culture, is a more sensory way of engaging and interacting. So intuitives become bilingual, and sensors generally don't ever have a reason to because they're not surrounded by intuitives. The principle doesn't go the other direction. So the question was, can a sensor be bilingual? Can that happen to them?
Yeah, we did an entire podcast, I think it was over a year ago now. I think it was a short series actually about intuitives and about if you're an intuitive, what does it mean? So one of the things that might be really helpful for you is to go, if you're a new listener especially, you haven't heard those, or maybe you haven't heard them in a while, go back and listen to those because we talk a lot about this idea. And the reason why intuitives are surrounded by so many sensors is because the population split is roughly about a 75-25 split. 75% of the population, roughly in general numbers, is a sensor, and 25% of the population are intuitives. And so this obviously almost is like a left-handed person growing up in a right-handed person's world. You have to adapt. And this idea of bilingual, we're not talking about actually speaking two different languages like your words in your language, but different languages in how you see the world. So we're using bilingual a little bit more loosely, not for like literal languages, but it is almost like another language. When you start speaking in abstract concepts, you start speaking in terms of pattern recognition and all this stuff, it feels like you're speaking a different language than what most people speak as an intuitive. And so intuitives become really good at speaking both ways, speaking in terms of this abstract stuff, which they don't get a lot of outlet for. One of the reasons why I think this podcast is popular is because it provides what we've called intuitive pornography for people to listen in on some abstract conversations. Maybe you're intuitive and you get to listen in on conversations that you would love to be a part of yourself. And we give you opportunities then to be engaged with those through the comments, through the community, stuff like that. And here, most of your life, if you're an intuitive, you have to go through and you interact with people that aren't speaking that language. And so you develop the ability to speak both sides of that. And I think that is a really good question. Can a sensor also develop the ability to speak both sides of those kind of ways of speaking?
Well, and you mentioned the podcast, and yeah, we've called ourselves, in a cheeky way, we've called ourselves intuitive porn, but it's not like we don't have a sensor audience. We actually have a pretty big sensor audience. There's a lot of sensors that listen to us. And so considering that, and considering that tons of sensors are into things like typology, which is very philosophical at this point. It's not known principles. It's not grounded in scientific principles. They're more philosophical, and they're more sort of pattern recognition concepts. So it's not like sensors can't be interested in those things. In fact, they very much can be. And I think this idea of a sensor being bilingual is absolutely a thing. Actually, I think it's absolutely a thing. And I think when it happens is in the rare time when a sensor grows up in an intuitive family, which is not nearly as common, but it does happen. In fact, your son Sawyer is an ESTJ, and he is, when he comes to stay with us, right, because we have him a percentage of the time because you have shared custody. He, unfortunately for the poor kid, he walks into an exclusively intuitive household.
Intuitive primary household.
Intuitive primary, that's right. Like our speculation, your older son Gunnar is probably an ENTP like me. And our youngest Piper, she's only 5 years old, so it's early days. But I mean, she seems to be manifesting all of the standard behaviors of an ENFP like you. So unfortunately, Sawyer is like surrounded, right? And he does the best he can. And I noticed that because we are actually activating his intuitive tertiary process or 10-year-old process in the CAR model. And of course, as always, if you're a first-time listener, go check out personalityhacker.com to check out what the CAR model is. Just look it up and you'll find some cool resources about how to understand cognitive functions in an easier way. But we pull on his 10-year-old in the CAR model, and we have to conscientiously make sure that we give his co-pilot of introverted sensing or memory enough time and enough feelings of safety and rootedness. We have to do that for him, even though it's our inferior or 3-year-old process. We know type, and we have to make sure we give him enough of that, because otherwise he would just be blasted with intuitive stuff all the time. I get the sense that when he grows up, he's probably going to be very comfortable around intuitives because he just always is. He's around intuitives all the time. So it can happen. And in those kinds of situations, I think sensors do end up having a higher tolerance and familiarity with intuitive conversation, intuitive thought, and intuitive modality. And in fact, what's interesting about sensors versus intuitives is that, and this plays out in, I thought, one of the most interesting things to come from our conversation with Dario Nardi the last time we interviewed him. I'm trying to remember which podcast number that was, but we interviewed him, and he mentioned that of all of the types when put in under an EEG machine or in an EEG machine to basically mind map what's going on for them, it was the ENFP type that was the most homogenous, and it was the ISJ type that was the least, meaning that
ISJs are the most diverse.
They're the most diverse, exactly.
In how their brain is showing up on these scans.
That's right. And they're leading with introverted sensing, which is a process that becomes accustomed to whatever it's familiar with over time. So actually, the process of introverted sensing is the most adaptive over time. And so sensors can be very adaptable to their context. And if they're surrounded by intuitives, then that's what's familiar. That's what they know. And they can really integrate a lot of those intuitive principles and ways of thinking and become almost uncomfortable if they're not around enough intuition, because that's what they grew up with. And so it's fascinating to see how, we talk about these things and we don't realize that we're unconsciously creating rules in people's minds. I never think about that. Like if I say something, though, people will think that that's how it works. But really, most of the time when we talk about these principles, we're not setting hard and fast rules here. We're just kind of talking about what the trends are. The trend is that intuitives are surrounded by sensors and so therefore become bilingual. That's the trend, but that's not the rule. The rule is that everything is a little different when it plays out in reality. These are all theories, but when you see it actually playing out in reality, there are sensors who are raised around intuitives that are also bilingual in the same way that an intuitive would be in the opposite context.
And to that point, it's more about interest and desire than it is about skill or ability. Now, obviously, if you have something higher up in your cognitive function stack, or what we use the CAR model, your driver cognitive process, you're going to have a lot more talent and skill there than you would your 3-year-old or inferior process. However, oftentimes it comes down to preferences and desire around that. And I think about our profiler training certification course where we teach people how to do live profiling, conversational profiling, somebody on an airplane, casually talking to somebody, being able to determine their personality type, or more formal sessions where, someone hires you basically to consult with them to help them determine their type. So we train people for both those angles in the profiler training course. And some of our best students, some of the students that have really understood the system, applied it well, they're very active, they're very interested, and they're very engaged, are actually sensors and actually sensing primary people. So I'm thinking in terms of like an ESFP, an ISFJ. Like we have sensors that are some of the best students in that. So I think I just say that to say that there's this notion that sensors aren't interested in this kind of thing. They wouldn't be able to keep up, quote unquote, with intuitive conversation. I don't think that's necessarily true. I really think it's a matter of they probably don't have a lot of interest in it. That doesn't mean that if they do have interest, they couldn't keep up in a lot of ways. And so I think that's important to make a distinction there. It's not a matter of like there's not an ability. It's more of just like, well, why they don't really see maybe an interest or a value in it when they're engaged in that kind of conversation.
Well, and if nobody has ever introduced these concepts to them, if they are a sensor, say, that's raised in a very sensor household and maybe in a very sensor culture, and none of this has ever been introduced to them, so there's going to be a sense of, there's going to be a little bit, they're going to be wary, right? Like we all are when things are ridiculously unfamiliar to us. But that, again, like you've said, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a peak of interest. I think another thing that's really interesting, and I think we mentioned this in previous podcasts, that everybody's an intuitive and everybody is a sensor. If you look at our cognitive function stack, in the 4 cognitive functions that influence us the most, or the people in our car, you're going to see both a sensor and an intuitive process. And they're going to fall in different places. It's going to be driver and 3-year-old for some people. It's going to be co-pilot and 10-year-old for some people. But we're all going to have both a sensor and an intuitive part. And they're going to be highly influential. They're going to influence things that are interesting to us and things we pursue. The further down they go in the stack, the more likely they're going to be childlike fascination. It's going to be more like fun and interesting. And so I've noticed that people who have intuition as a 10-year-old or a 3-year-old process are usually interested in things, not like they take a job where intuition was a major feature of that career, but it's more like they are kind of fascinated by things like fantasy, or they're fascinated by like future predictions in sci-fi, or they're fascinated by games, or like
my friend Scott's an ISFJ and he teaches improv.
Right.
So that's an extroverted intuition style, activity. And that's his little 3-year-old inferior process. And he teaches improv and he's really good at it.
Yeah. And he loves it because it's all play, right? Like the stakes aren't high there. Like it's all just playful. And so this idea, can a sensor speak intuitive language? I would say yes, very much so. And it's usually in fun. It's usually fun, play, something that's kind of, interesting. And I would say that the more intuitive you are, as in like the higher up it goes on your stack, the higher threshold you have for intuitive conversation, and the more you're okay with putting your chips on the intuitive, you're going to put them on that square. Like you're going to make it so that intuition becomes a part of your life. And that, all of us that have intuition as a driver or dominant process are looking for careers, and we're looking for, ways to manifest this intuition in our day-to-day experience because it's so rewarding for us. And I would say if intuition falls further down on the stack, if it's like in the backseat of your car, you're less likely to pursue something on that level. But intuitive conversation isn't always playing at that level. A lot of times it's more playful. It's like a little bit more like speculative and fun and what if. A person who's leading with intuition, I kind of see it this way. A person who's leading with intuition has endless amounts of space for intuitive conversation. Like there is no threshold. As an intuitive driver, and you're an intuitive driver, Joel, and a lot of our audience, you might be listening, an intuitive driver, that you will have those kinds of conversations until you literally pass out. Like you'll sit by the fire drinking wine or tea or whatever, and at 3:00 in the morning, you're like, oh, maybe I should go to bed and stop talking about like the future implications of AI. Like maybe that's what we should do. And the further down in the stack it is, the less the threshold is going to be. If it's a co-pilot, you're probably going to be able to do that, maybe not quite endlessly, but for a long time. If it's a 10-year-old, you're probably going to max out at a couple hours. And if it's a 3-year-old process, you might max out about 45 minutes or an hour. But that doesn't mean that 45 minutes or an hour is going to be unpleasant to you. It's just going to hit a law of diminishing returns much quicker. And the opposite holds true for sensory things. If you're sensory dominant, you're going to have almost endless amounts of space for sensory activities and conversation. And the further down it goes, like as a sensor inferior or a 3-year-old process, I will say that, I'm not a person who talks crap about small talk. Like, I know everybody hates small talk, and I've kind of talked a little bit about how I don't like it, but I'm getting to a point where I'm really understanding its utility. I'm at a point right now where if I talk, and this is how, by the way, I'm defining small talk. Other people might define it differently, but if I'm sitting down and having a conversation with somebody about like what's going on in their life, and the people they're connected to, and what's going on in their lives, and those people, and what's going on with their day to day, and where like just incidentals. I wouldn't call it small talk. I would call it more incidental conversation. Just incidentals of life. I have a threshold of about 45 minutes to an hour of those conversations. And in that 45 minutes, it's totally pleasant for me. I'm like enjoying the conversation. I'm enjoying getting to know what's going on in people's lives and catching up and figuring out like what's the best, what are the schools zoned for and why that school's a good one and that one's not that good. And like, just sort of the incidentals of life or politics or whatever. But about 45 minutes or an hour, I'm like, okay, I'm done. And if I had to keep going, I would find it unpleasant after that. But for that 45 minutes, it was great. So I think that's kind of how it works. Once you hit the threshold, suddenly it becomes a chore. But before you hit the threshold, it's totally awesome. And I would say that for people who are sensors that can speak both languages, they might have actually a higher threshold because they're used to it. It might be more pleasant for them while they're doing it, but they're still going to have that threshold to some extent. So when you're trying to determine your type, remember, it's less about an on-off switch, like I can or can't do this, and it's more like, where are my thresholds at?
Yeah, desire and threshold. I think those are the two things I would take away from this. And, if you're determining your type between maybe sensor or intuitive, I think those are some things you can look at. And again, there's a lot of articles over at personalityhacker.com if you're still kind of going between those two, and you can probably get some more nuances there as well.
I know we're wrapping up. I just wanted to say one more thing before we end the podcast. This also works for thinker-feeler.
Of course.
Not just sensor intuitive. Think in terms of thresholds. Like when we have these stereotypes about thinkers being cold and robotic, and we have these stereotypes about feelers, being irrational and being unable to produce thought, and they're just like emotive and huggy all the time. It's actually more, think of them in terms of thresholds for what's emotionally versus mentally taxing. And I think that for me, I have, as a feeling 10-year-old or tertiary, I probably have a higher threshold for emotional experience and being able to hold emotions for people than somebody who was feeling 3-year-old or inferior. But I still don't have nearly the capacity to hold emotions like you do. Like you have so much higher of a threshold for being able to, sort of create a space for drama or for other people's drama.
Or create drama myself, really.
Or create drama yourself, right? You kind of, there's an enjoyment in it.
Yeah.
And I just don't have, I'm like, I can do that for a time, but then I'm like, okay, I'm done. And then when I'm done, I'm exhausted. And I think the opposite can happen with just really heady thinking things, right? Like you don't have the same capacity to just meticulously go through all of the details of information like I do. In fact, you're just like, why did the details matter that much? And I'm like, they matter, right? Like, it's really important to get all of this pure. And you're like, it doesn't matter. It's the concept, right? So you're always bringing it to the concept as opposed to like meticulously wanting to make sure all the information is pure. So I think that's the other thing is when you're trying to determine if you're a thinker or feeler, also ask yourself, what's your threshold for intellectual purity versus emotional, space holding? And that might help you in that way too.
So where are you at in this journey? Are you an intuitive that you've figured out ways to have sensor conversation? Are you a sensor that is bilingual, like what we're talking about? You have a threshold. You can go on for a while, but there is a limit to how long you feel comfortable or really enjoy doing this, having these kind of conversations. I think it'd be really interesting to get some feedback from you personally to know what your thresholds are, where you see yourself in this, what your experience is. Come over to personalityhacker.com and leave a comment or ask a question below this podcast. We'd love to hear from you as the third person in this conversation. And also, while you're at it, come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker. Join our community of like minds, people that are just like you, that want to grow themselves. They're interested in typology, but they're interested not just in typology. They're also interested in learning about themselves to bring what they're designed to bring to the world. That's really what we're trying to build here at Personality Hackers, a community of like minds that want to be contributors, want to be thought leaders, want to be people that are thinking about life and the universe and everything in a little bit of a different way, that want to move the ball forward, move humanity forward. And I think that you'd really fit in well at that community. So we'd love to have you come over and be a part of that if you haven't done so already. You can also find us on twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly magnanimous, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.